Every man carries a past, but some carry it like a grave on their back. Out here in the quiet dust of the frontier, there's a rancher who visits the same unmarked mound every Monday. No prayers, no words, just silence. They say he's a good man. They say he's a dangerous one. But what kind of sin could make a man punish himself for years without mercy? Stay with me, because this story isn't about what happened. It's about what it cost.
Every Monday morning, before the sun even clears the ridge, that's when he does it. Caleb Dunn walks out the back door of his cabin. He steps past the smokehouse, out to the far edge of the property where the prairie grass grows a little too wild. There's a mound of dirt there. No headstone, no wooden cross. Just dirt. He bends down, places a single wild bluebonnet on the frozen earth. He doesn't pray, he doesn't speak, he just turns his back and walks away. He has done this for 4 years, every single week, and he will keep doing it until the day they put him in the ground, too. Make no mistake, this isn't an act of devotion. It is a sentence. Cedar Flat, Montana Territory, spring of 1883. It's a small place. 340 souls, 1 church, 1 saloon, which Caleb never steps foot in. He runs a modest spread, 80 acres, 47 head of cattle, got a 19-year-old kid named Jesse helping him mend fences and brand calves. Folks in town? They think Caleb is just a quiet man, a good neighbor who keeps his head down. But Doc Harlan, over at the Mercantile, Doc knows better. Caleb Dunn is the kindest man in this valley, Doc likes to say, packing his pipe. And the most terrifying, because a man who refuses every single comfort in this world, well, he's either a saint or he's punishing himself for a sin we don't know about. Doc is right, it's the latter, but guilt doesn't pay the bills, and the bills are coming due. Caleb sits at his rough-hewn kitchen table. In his hand is a letter from the First Bank of Cedar Flat. A loan, $340, due in exactly 90 days. He could sell off the herd, sure. But winter is coming fast. If he sells now, he loses the spring calf crop. He'd be ruined. For a brief, fleeting second, he thinks about a certain bank account back in Oregon. A lot of money sitting there, waiting. He crushes the thought before it even takes a breath. No, not an option. Never an option. Later that afternoon, Caleb rides into town. He steps into the post office. Dust dances in the shafts of sunlight. Mrs. Pruitt is behind the counter sorting the afternoon mail. Over on the far wall, there's a community board, faded paper, lost dogs, bounties, and one small notice. It's been pinned there for 3 weeks, gathering dust. Caleb steps closer. He reads it. Experienced bookkeeper seeks position in rural area. Willing to work for room and board plus small wage. References available. Contact Miss E. Marlowe, General Delivery, Denver. Mrs. Pruitt looks up, shaking her head. Who around here needs a bookkeeper? Odd thing for a woman to be asking. Caleb doesn't answer. He just looks at the paper. The bank is squeezing him. The numbers don't make sense. He knows cows. He knows land. He doesn't know compound interest, and he suspects the banker knows that. He needs a sharp eye. He walks over to the counter, dips a pen in the inkwell, and writes a short, heavy letter. Miss Marlowe, I have a ranch in Cedar Flat, Montana Territory. I need my ledgers sorted. 90 days. You'll have a room separate from the main house, $3 a week plus your meals. The work is honest. The conditions are hard. If you can stomach both, come. He hands the letter to Mrs. Pruitt, pays the postage, and rides back to the ranch. But when he gets home before he goes inside, he stops. The wind picks up, biting at the collar of his coat. He walks slowly back out to that unmarked mound of dirt behind the smokehouse. He looks down at the fading bluebonnet, and for the first time in 4 years, he speaks. I'm sorry. His voice is rough, gravel and smoke. I didn't go looking for this. I just need someone to help me keep the land. He takes a slow, deep breath. The Montana wind howls back at him. I'm not swearing any new oaths, he whispers to the cold earth. I have no more oaths left to give. 3 weeks later. The stagecoach from Denver rolled into Cedar Flat. It didn't stop long. Just enough time for the dust to catch up to the wheels, choke the horses for a second, and settle back down into the dirt. Caleb was out front, mending a section of split-rail fence. He had a hammer in one hand, a mouthful of iron nails in the other. He heard the creak of the springs, the snort of the team. He didn't look up right away. Folks passing through weren't his business. But then the wagon didn't roll on. It stopped at the edge of his property. Caleb took the nails out of his mouth. He stood up, wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of a leather-gloved hand. A woman stepped down from the carriage. She didn't stumble, didn't wait for the driver to offer a hand. She just planted her boots on the Montana dirt like she already owned it. Caleb narrowed his eyes against the afternoon sun. He took her in piece by piece. Dark brown hair, pulled back tight, practical, slate-gray eyes, calm, too calm, high cheekbones, a jaw set like granite. For about 3 seconds he didn't recognize her. He just saw a woman, a stranger, someone who didn't belong out here in the middle of nowhere. And then he looked down. He looked at the dress. The hammer slipped from his hand. It hit the dirt with a dull thud. But Caleb didn't hear it. The whole world, the wind, the horses, the hammering in his own chest, just went dead silent. Slate blue poplin, Nottingham lace around the collar. His lungs stopped working. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't blink. Because he knew that dress. He bought the fabric for it. Spring of 1877, Callahan's General Store back in Oregon. It cost him $8.02, a fortune for a deputy. Clara had sewn it herself. It took her 2 weeks. She pricked her finger 4 times, bled on the hem, and had to wash it out. She told him, laughing in the kitchen, that she was going to wear it on their wedding day. She wore it exactly once, to a Sunday picnic in June, before the typhoid fever took her. He buried Clara in a different dress, because that blue poplin, it was too beautiful for the dirt. He gave it back to her mother. He thought he would never ever see it again. And now, here it was, breathing, moving, walking toward him. Caleb stood frozen. The pieces clicked together in his head with the heavy, terrifying sound of a jail cell locking. He looked from the dress up to the slate-gray eyes. Sister. She was Clara's younger sister. Eliza. And she hadn't put this dress on by accident. Women don't travel 300 miles in a dead girl's Sunday best unless they are looking to raise a ghost. She wore it for him. She wore it so he would see it. She knew exactly who he was. But what in God's name did she want? And what was her married name? Eliza saw his eyes change. She saw the blood drain from his face. She knew he recognized the fabric. It was the first flaw in her plan. She hadn't counted on a man remembering the lace on a collar after 6 years. But she didn't flinch. She closed the distance, stopped 3 feet from him. She held out a gloved hand. "Mr. Dunn," she said. Her voice was smooth. Cold water over river stones. "I am Eliza Marlowe. I am here to answer your notice." Caleb didn't take her hand. He couldn't. He just stared at the Nottingham lace. A long, heavy silence stretched between them. Only the wind dared to speak. Finally, Caleb found his voice. It sounded like it belonged to a dead man. "You're not a Marlowe." Eliza held his gaze, unblinking. "Marlowe was my mother's maiden name. And your real name?" "I will tell you, Mr. Dunn, when you are ready to hear it." She lowered her hand. "But right now I am here to work. My trunk is on the coach. Do you need a bookkeeper, or don't you?" Caleb looked at her, really looked at her. She was daring him to send her away, daring him to be a coward. He swallowed hard. "The workers' room is on the east side of the cabin," he said, his voice flat. "Dinner is at 6, and we are never going to talk about that dress again." Night fell over Cedar Flat. The wind howled around the eaves of the cabin, rattling the window panes. Inside the small east room, a kerosene lantern burned low. Eliza sat on the edge of the narrow cot. The house was quiet. Caleb was asleep, or pretending to be, in the main room. She reached into her travel trunk. pulled out a small wooden box, solid oak, heavy iron lock. She took a key from a ribbon around her neck, turned it. Click. She opened the lid. Inside wasn't a bookkeeper's ledger. It wasn't pens or ink. She reached in and pulled out a stack of letters. The paper was yellowing. The handwriting was looped and elegant. Clara's handwriting. "He reads books, Eliza," the top letter said. "He doesn't drink. He's gentle with the horses. If I don't live long enough to marry him, please don't let him be alone too long." Eliza's jaw tightened. She set the letter aside. She reached deeper into the box, pulled out a stiff legal document. A certificate of transfer. From the First Bank of Cedar Flat, routed through Denver. A debt of $340, bought and paid for. Now owned entirely by the woman holding the paper. And beneath that, one final document. A death certificate. Name of deceased, Robert Morrison. Date of death, September 14th, 1879. Eliza stared at the name. Her husband's name. The man who had died in Caleb Dunn's jail cell. She wasn't just Clara's sister. She was the widow Morrison. She hadn't come to Montana to balance ledgers. She had come with 3 questions burning a hole in her chest. Did this man kill her husband out of malice? Did he truly love her sister? And if the answer to both was yes, what in the name of God was she supposed to do about it? She carefully folded the papers, placed them back in the wooden box, locked it tight. "I'm here, Robert," she whispered to the empty room. "I'm going to find out what he is." The first 2 weeks were a quiet kind of war. Not with words, never with words, but with silence. And with work. Eliza was terrifyingly efficient. Caleb had expected a woman playing a game. What he got was a machine. She didn't use a single ounce of charm. She didn't smile at him over coffee. She didn't bat her eyelashes when she asked for the receipts. She just worked. She took his chaotic, whiskey-stained ledgers, his stuffed envelopes of unpaid bills, and she laid them out on the kitchen table like a general planning a battlefield. She worked from sunup until the kerosene ran dry at night. She called him Mr. Dunn. He called her Miss Marlowe. They both knew it was a lie, but it was a lie they needed to survive the day. And here's the thing about Caleb. He wasn't impressed by beauty. He'd seen beautiful women ruin good men. But competence, hard, unyielding grit, that commanded his respect. And slowly, without him realizing it, that respect started to chip away at the ice. It wasn't a sudden romance, it was just gravity. The unavoidable pull of 2 people sharing a small space in a hard world. It started with the small things. Day 8, high noon. Eliza was out by the clothesline, pinning up wet sheets. The wind whipped the canvas around. She reached for the rope and flinched. A sharp, sudden gasp. A paper wasp. Nasty little devils that build nests in the porch eaves. It caught her right on the inside of her wrist. Caleb was by the trough. He saw her drop the sheet, saw her grip her arm. He walked over, didn't say a word. He just reached down into the damp earth by the trough, scooped up a thumb-sized lump of wet red clay. He stepped up to her, reached out. Eliza went rigid. Her instinct was to pull away. "Hold still," he murmured. His hand caught her wrist. His skin was rough, calloused from years of leather and rope. He pressed the cool, wet clay directly over the swelling sting. "Draws the poison out," he said quietly. For 2 seconds, exactly 2 seconds, his thumb lingered against her pulse. He felt it race, a frantic, fluttering bird beneath her skin. He pulled his hand back like he'd touched a hot stove, turned around, walked back to the barn. Neither of them said a word about it at dinner. Day 11. Caleb got caught out in a spring squall. Freezing rain. He rode in late, soaked to the bone, shaking with a mild fever. He locked himself in his room, coughing a wet, rattling cough. At 7 o'clock, he heard a quiet knock at his door. He didn't answer. Footsteps walked away. An hour later, he finally opened the door. Sitting on the floorboards was a ceramic bowl. Beef stew. Thick with onions and wild garlic. steam rising off the top. Tucked under the spoon was a torn piece of ledger paper. Eat it while it's warm. Caleb took the bowl. He ate it in the dark. And when he was done, he didn't throw the paper away. He folded it up tight and small and slipped it into his breast pocket. Day 13. Jesse, the ranch hand, was fixing a broken chair in the kitchen. He was a good kid, talkative. He was telling a story about a stubborn mule he used to own back in Texas. A mule that would only walk backward if you yelled at it. Eliza was at the table adding up a column of numbers. Jesse hit the punchline, and Eliza, she laughed. Not a polite, tight-lipped chuckle, a real, full-throated laugh. It broke out of her, bright and clear, echoing off the timber walls. Caleb was standing by the stove. He froze with a coffee pot in his hand. He closed his eyes. He realized right then that he hadn't heard a woman laugh in this house. Not in 4 years. The sound of it physically hurt him. It was a phantom limb acting up. It reminded him of everything he had lost, everything he had thrown away. He set the pot down quietly, and he walked out the back door so no one would see his face. But the quiet couldn't last, not with Eliza digging through the numbers. On the 15th day, she found it. She was cross-referencing Caleb's bank statements from the First Bank of Cedar Flat. The interest rate was 8%. High, but legal. But the math was wrong. She ran the column 3 times. Her pencil hovered over the paper. Henry Colfax, the town banker, wasn't calculating the compound interest quarterly, like the contract stated. He was doing it monthly. It was a subtle shift. Over 3 years, it only amounted to $47. But $47 on a $300 loan? That was the difference between keeping the land and losing it. Colfax wasn't making a mistake. He was bleeding Caleb on purpose, trying to force a default so the bank could seize the property. Eliza sat back in her chair. She looked at Caleb's closed bedroom door. Why hadn't he caught this? Why hadn't he fought it? A man who fought for a living, a former deputy. Why was he just letting them take his life away? She wrote the discrepancy down in her private notebook. But she didn't tell him. Because if she told him, she'd have to explain how she knew banking law so well, and she couldn't afford that conversation. Not yet. That evening, after Jesse had gone to the bunkhouse. The fire was dying down to embers. Caleb sat in the rocking chair, stitching a torn bridle. Eliza was on the sofa, mending a cuff on her blouse. The silence was heavier than usual. "Miss Marlowe," Caleb said suddenly, his voice rough in the quiet. "Yes, Mr. Dunn. You're too good for this." Eliza stopped sewing. She didn't look up. "Too good for what?" "This work. You've got a mind for numbers. Why aren't you working in a bank in Denver, or doing ledgers for the mining syndicates? Why are you out here working for room and board in the dirt?" She answered fast. Too fast. "Because Denver banks don't hire women to handle their money, and mining syndicates want men who will drink whiskey with them after shift. Out here, the work speaks for itself." Caleb stopped stitching. He looked at her. He nodded slowly. "I see." He didn't push it. He let the conversation die. But later that night in his room, Caleb lit a single candle. He opened his leather-bound journal. He picked up his pen, dipped it in black ink, and wrote. She answered too fast, like she rehearsed it in the mirror. "Nobody practices the truth," and she wore her dead sister's dress the day she walked onto my land. "Women don't wear the clothes of the dead without a reason. I don't know what game she is playing, but I shouldn't trust her." Caleb stared at the page, the ink drying in the dim light. He picked up the pen again. He drew a single hard line through the words "shouldn't." Above it he wrote, "can't." I can't trust her, because "can't" was the honest word, and the honesty of it terrified him. The frontier is a quiet place, but it is never silent. If you listen close enough, you can hear the land whispering, and if you listen to the people, you can hear the snare pulling tight. It started with a loaf of bread. 4 weeks into Eliza's stay, a wagon rolled up the drive. A woman climbed down, mid-50s, iron-gray hair tucked under a practical bonnet. She carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth. The smell of warm yeast and butter drifted up the porch steps. Hattie Dunlop, the neighboring widow. Eliza met her at the door. Caleb was out by the far ridge tracking a stray calf. "Miss Marlowe, isn't it?" Hattie smiled. It was a polite smile. But her eyes were taking inventory. They swept over Eliza, over the clean floorboards, over the way Caleb's boots were lined up by the door, neat and orderly. "I brought some sourdough," Hattie said, handing over the basket. "Just wanted to make sure Mr. Dunn was being looked after. He's a good neighbor, but he's been alone a long time. People in town are starting to wonder." Eliza took the basket. The bread was warm against her palms. She looked at Hattie, really looked at her. Hattie wasn't just a gossiping old woman. There was a sharpness to her, a vested interest. Eliza didn't know it yet, but Hattie had a stake in this land, a stake in the ghosts that haunted it. "Mr. Dunn is an excellent employer," Eliza said evenly. "He keeps to himself, and I keep his books. There is nothing for the town to wonder about." Hattie's smile thinned, just a fraction. "I'm glad to hear it, Miss Marlowe. I truly am." Hattie left, but the air in the cabin felt heavier after she drove away. The town was watching. The clock was ticking. That afternoon, Eliza rode the buckboard into Cedar Flat to collect the mail. Mrs. Pruitt handed her a thick envelope. "General delivery, postmarked Denver." Eliza didn't open it in the post office. She waited until she was halfway back to the ranch. She pulled the horses to a halt by the creek, out of sight of the road. The wind rustled the cottonwoods. She broke the wax seal. It was from Greer, her attorney. The words were written in crisp legal script. Cold, detached. "Mrs. Morrison, the probate court is moving forward. The 120 acres in Oregon remain contested. To unfreeze the assets and transfer the deed to your name, we must prove gross negligence or criminal malice on the part of Deputy Caleb Dunn in the death of your husband. If we fail, the estate will be seized to pay Robert's outstanding debts. You will be left with nothing." Eliza lowered the letter. Her hands were shaking, not from the cold, from the sheer, terrifying weight of what was at stake. She wasn't just here for revenge. She was here for survival. In 1883, a widow without property was a woman without a shield. She would be at the mercy of boarding houses, seamstress work, until her eyes failed, a life of begging for scraps. She needed Caleb Dunn to be a monster. She needed him to be a murderer, because if he wasn't, she was ruined. Night fell. Eliza sat on her narrow cot in the dark. The letter was folded tightly in her lap. She closed her eyes, and despite everything she tried to do to stop it, the memory dragged her under. Silver Falls, Oregon. October, 1879. It was a month after Robert died in Caleb's jail cell. She was sitting in her parlor, wearing black widow's weeds. Across from her sat the territorial investigator, a man with a thick mustache and a notepad. "Mrs. Morrison," the investigator had asked, his pen hovering over the paper, "I need to ask a delicate question. Did your husband have a history of violence? A temper?" Eliza had sat there, her hands folded in her lap. If she told the truth, if she said Robert was a drunk, if she said that behind closed doors, the charming land broker turned into something vicious, if she admitted he had knocked out her back molar 3 months into their marriage, what would happen? Society would say she drove him to it. The courts would invalidate Robert's will, handing everything over to his estranged brother out in Montana. She would be a penniless, battered widow, an object of pity, an outcast. She was 24 years old, and she was terrified. So Eliza looked the investigator right in the eye, and she lied. "My husband never raised a hand to me," she had whispered. "He was a gentleman, a kind man." It was a lie built on shame, a lie built on the desperate need to survive. But that lie, that single cowardly sentence, it became the rope they used to hang Caleb Dunn. Because if Robert Morrison was a gentleman, then why did Caleb have to use force in that jail cell? Why did Caleb throw a gentleman hard enough against an iron cot to crack his skull? Her lie made Caleb look like a brute, a killer with a badge. It got him fired. It destroyed his reputation. It drove him out of Oregon straight into this exile in Montana. In the dark of her room, Eliza opened her eyes. A tear broke hot and fast down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She had spent 4 years convincing herself that Caleb Dunn deserved what he got. It was the only way she could sleep at night. But what if he didn't? What if Caleb had been doing his job? What if Robert had fought back, the way he always fought when he was cornered? If Caleb is innocent, Eliza thought, her chest tight with panic, then my lie ruined a good man. She looked at the wooden box holding her secrets. She had come here to judge him. But sitting in the dark, clutching the lawyer's letter, Eliza realized the horrifying truth. The person who deserved the harshest judgment in this house wasn't the man sleeping in the next room. It was her. There is a rule on the frontier, older than the state lines, older than the barbed wire. You don't work on Sunday, you don't mend fence, you don't brand cattle, you don't balance the books. You let the land breathe, and you let yourself remember you're a human being, not just a plow mule. It was the 28th day Eliza had been at the ranch. Caleb woke up at 5:30. Habit. His eyes snapped open, and for a second he braced himself for the crushing weight of the day. Then he remembered. Sunday. He pulled on his trousers, walked out to the kitchen in his socks. He stopped in the doorway. The coffee was already boiling on the stove. Eliza was awake. She was sitting in the rocking chair by the cold hearth. She was wearing a simple cotton dress, no corset. Her hair hung in a loose braid over her shoulder. She was reading a book. For 4 years, Caleb had made his own coffee on Sunday mornings. It was a lonely, bitter ritual. Now, the smell of it filled the room, warm, alive. He didn't say anything. He just poured a cup, sat down at the heavy oak table. She turned a page. The paper rasped softly in the quiet. He drank his coffee. 20 minutes passed. Neither of them spoke a word. And for the first time in as long as Caleb could remember, the silence wasn't heavy. It didn't feel like a graveyard. It felt like peace. By mid-morning, the sun was high and bright, the kind of pale, golden light you only get in late April. Caleb stepped off the porch to check the north fence line. Just a walk. No tools. Eliza stepped off the porch a moment later. She headed south toward the creek. They didn't walk together. They didn't plan it. But 30 minutes later, the geography of the ranch brought them to the same place, the bend in the creek where the water cuts through the limestone. Caleb sat down on a fallen cottonwood log. Eliza found a flat, sun-warmed rock about 10 feet away. She sat down, arranging her skirts. Still no words, just the sound of the water rushing over smooth stones. A blue jay flashing through the branches overhead, arguing with a squirrel. The smell of wet earth and crushed pine needles. They sat there for an hour. A man and a woman, 10 feet apart, sharing the world, sharing the sunlight. Caleb watched a leaf float down the creek. He felt the tension in his shoulders slowly uncoil. The tight, burning knot in his chest, the one that had lived there since Silver Falls, eased up. Just a fraction, but enough for him to take a full, deep breath. When the sun started to dip, Eliza finally stood up. She brushed the dirt from her skirt. She looked at him. "How long have you been out here, Mr. Dunn?" Her voice was soft. It didn't break the quiet. It just folded into it. 4 years, Caleb said, and 3 months. "Do you ever think about leaving?" "No." "Because you love the land?" Caleb looked down at his boots. He took his time with the answer. He wanted to give her the truth. "No," he said quietly. "I stay because out here, no one knows my name well enough to say it like a curse." Eliza didn't flinch. She didn't offer pity. Pity was cheap, and she knew he wouldn't take it. She just nodded. A slow, profound gesture of understanding. "I see," she said. They walked back to the cabin. parallel lines, never touching, but closer than they had ever been that afternoon. Eliza sat on the front porch. The book was open in her lap. An 1881 edition of Whitman's Leaves of Grass. Caleb was sitting on a wooden crate on the far side of the porch, rubbing neatsfoot oil into a stiff saddle. They were entirely alone. Jesse had ridden into town to see his mother. The rhythmic shh of the rag against the leather. The slow turning of pages. Eliza cleared her throat. She didn't look up from the book. She just started reading aloud, not performing, just sharing a thought she found beautiful. I think I could turn and live with animals. They are so placid and self-contained. Caleb stopped rubbing the leather. He rested his hands on his knees. I stand and look at them long and long, she read, her voice drifting out over the empty prairie. They do not sweat and whine about their condition. They do not lie awake in the dark and weep for their sins. She stopped. She closed the book. Caleb didn't say a word, but he felt those words sink straight into his marrow. They do not weep for their sins. The sun dropped below the horizon. The sky bruised purple and dark blue. The chill of the Montana night crept up the porch steps. Eliza stood up. "Good evening, Mr. Dunn." "Miss Marlowe." She went inside. The screen door shut behind her with a soft click. Caleb stayed on the porch. The oil rag hung loose in his hand. He watched the stars punch through the dark one by one. It had been the best Sunday he had experienced in 4 years. Nothing happened. Absolutely nothing. And that was what made it a miracle. But as the cold set in, a new feeling washed over him. It wasn't peace anymore. It was terror. The next morning, Monday, the frost was thick on the grass. Caleb walked out behind the smokehouse. He stood before the unmarked mound of dirt. He held the wild bluebonnet in his hand, but he didn't put it down right away. He stared at the dirt. His jaw trembled. "Robert," he whispered. It was the first time he had spoken the dead man's name aloud in 4 years. The sound of it tasted like ash. "Robert, I know who she is. I don't know what her game is, but I know she's Clara's blood." Caleb gripped the flower tight. The stem snapped. "For 4 years," Caleb said, his voice breaking. "This place has just been timber and nails, a place to sleep. But yesterday, it felt like a home." A ragged breath tore its way out of Caleb's chest. "And I am terrified, Robert, because the last time a place felt like a home, I burned it to the ground to pay for what I did to you. I don't know if I can survive doing it again." He dropped the broken flower onto the dirt. He turned, and he walked back to the house where the ghost in the blue dress was waiting. Numbers don't lie. People lie. People twist and hide and bury their sins under pleasantries. But numbers? They sit on the page. Cold. Absolute. Eliza sat at Caleb's desk. The afternoon sun cast long, hard shadows across the floorboards. She rubbed her temples. Her eyes burned from staring at the columns. She had finished the audit. The ledger for the First Bank of Cedar Flat was balanced, and it painted an ugly picture. Henry Colfax, the banker, was a thief. Not the kind who uses a gun and a mask, the kind who uses a fountain pen and a smile. He was compounding the interest monthly instead of quarterly, bleeding Caleb out, 50 cents at a time, trying to choke him off the land. Eliza set her pencil down. She looked around the quiet cabin. Caleb was out in the south pasture. Jesse was with him. She was entirely alone. She leaned back in the heavy oak chair. Why does he let them do it? It didn't make sense. Caleb Dunn wasn't a stupid man. He was observant. He noticed when a horse favored a leg. He noticed when the wind shifted. How could he not notice that the bank was stealing his life? Unless he just didn't care. Eliza's eyes drifted down to the bottom right drawer of the desk. It was the only drawer Caleb kept locked. She had noticed it her first week here. She hadn't touched it. A good investigator knows when to push and when to wait. But the wait was over. She needed to know what this man was hiding. She stood up, walked over to the mantelpiece. Caleb kept a rusted Prince Albert tobacco tin up there. He didn't smoke a pipe anymore, but he kept the tin. She opened it. Inside, sitting on a bed of dry, ancient tobacco, was a small brass key. Eliza took it. Her heart bumped a heavy rhythm against her ribs. She walked back to the desk, slipped the key into the lock. Click. She pulled the heavy wooden drawer open. There were no guns, no whiskey bottles, no hidden letters from other women. There was just a single thick manila envelope. Eliza pulled it out. The paper was heavy, expensive, not local. She untied the string closure, slid the contents onto the desk. Bank statements, but not from Cedar Flat. The letterhead read, Willamette Trust Bank, Portland, Oregon. Eliza frowned. She picked up the top sheet. It was dated March of 1883, just 2 months ago. She ran her finger down to the balance line. She stopped. She blinked, thinking her tired eyes were playing tricks on her. She read the number again. $2,047.32. Eliza let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. $2,000. It was a staggering sum. A man could buy 3 ranches the size of this one with that kind of money. He could pay off Colfax tomorrow and spit in his eye. Where did it come from? She dug deeper into the pile. She found the deposit slips, quarterly deposits, tracing all the way back to the summer of 1880, and then she found the source document. A legal settlement. Caleb James Dunn versus the city of Silver Falls. Eliza's hands started to shake. After Caleb had been fired, after her lie had made him look like a rogue deputy, he had sued the city for wrongful termination. And he had won. The city had paid him to go away quietly. He's rich, she thought, her mind spinning. He's sitting on a fortune, and he's living out here, eating beans and wearing patched shirts, letting a small-town banker steal his land over $300. It made no sense. It was madness. She reached into the envelope one last time. There was a folded piece of stationery, a carbon copy of a letter Caleb had written to Willamette Trust. Eliza unfolded it. The handwriting was sharp, uncompromising. To the directors of Willamette Trust, the letter began. I acknowledge receipt of the settlement funds. You are to hold every cent of it in my account. You are not to send me drafts. You are not to send me cash. I will not touch it. Eliza read faster. If I die before these funds are exhausted, this letter serves as my final instruction. You will transfer the entire balance to the Silver Falls Displaced Families Relief Fund. You will do it anonymously. My name is not to be attached to it. Eliza stopped. The air in the room suddenly felt entirely sucked away, the Displaced Families Relief Fund. She knew those families. She knew exactly who they were. They were the 20 pioneer families who had bought government land from a charming silver-tongued broker. Land the broker had no legal right to sell. Land they were evicted from by the Territorial Army, leaving them with nothing. The broker who sold them that fake land was Robert Morrison, her husband. Eliza dropped the letter. It fluttered to the desk. She backed away from the chair. Her legs hit the edge of the sofa, and she sank down onto the cushions. Caleb wasn't hiding stolen money. He was hiding his own martyrdom. He refused to touch a single penny of his settlement, because the money came from the taxes of the town that had buried Robert. He considered it blood money. Instead, he had quietly, anonymously, dedicated every cent of it to repairing the damage Robert Morrison had caused. He was feeding the families Robert had starved. He was sheltering the people Robert had made homeless. And he was doing it while letting his own life rot away in the Montana dirt. Eliza put her hands over her face. She had come here looking for a monster, a brutal, careless cop who had murdered her husband. She had brought Clara's dress like a weapon, ready to break him. But Caleb Dunn wasn't a monster. He was a man who possessed a conscience so deep, so crushing, that it was literally killing him. He chose poverty not because he had no options, but because he couldn't stomach profiting from the aftermath of a tragedy. And what had she done? Eliza let out a low, ragged sob. She had lied. In 1879, she had sat in her parlor and told the investigator that Robert was a gentleman. She had painted Robert as a saint to protect her own inheritance. Her lie had made Caleb's self-defense look like cold-blooded murder. I did this to him, she realized, the horror washing over her like ice water. I put him in this exile. I forced him to carry my husband's sins. She looked over at the locked wooden box sitting by her cot in the other room, the box that held her evidence. The deed to his debt. It wasn't evidence. It was an executioner's axe. And she was holding the handle. Eliza sat in the quiet cabin, the ticking of the grandfather clock sounding like a gavel dropping over and over. She had come to Montana to find justice. She just hadn't realized that when justice finally arrived, she would be the one standing on the gallows. You can run far, you can run fast, you can cross state lines and change your whiskey and stop answering to your name. But the past? The past rides a very fast horse. It was a Wednesday morning. Doc Harlan drove his black buggy up the ranch road. The dust plumed behind the wheels like smoke. Caleb was out by the barn, shoeing a roan gelding. He saw the buggy coming. He didn't stop working. He just filed down the hoof, calm and steady. Doc pulled the horses up, set the brake. He didn't go up to the house. He walked straight to the barn. "Morning, Caleb," Doc said. He pulled a pouch of tobacco from his vest. "Doc." Caleb didn't look up. Doc took his time packing his pipe, stripped a match against a stall post, puffed until the cherry glowed. "Got a telegram at the Mercantile this morning," Doc said quietly. "From a colleague of mine down in Denver. Seems there's a lawyer named Greer poking around the territorial records." Caleb's hands went still on the rasp. "Poking into what?" "A case out of Silver Falls, Oregon," Doc said, blowing a stream of blue smoke into the barn rafters. 1879. A man named Morrison. Caleb slowly lowered the horse's hoof. He stood up straight. He looked at Doc. Doc Harlan was the only man in Montana who knew the whole truth. When Caleb first rode into Cedar Flat, half dead from a hunting accident, Doc had patched him up. Doc had seen the old bullet scar on Caleb's chest, a scar a disgraced deputy shouldn't have. And in the fever of that night, Caleb had talked. "There's something else, Caleb," Doc said, stepping closer. His voice dropped to a whisper. "That lawyer, he works for Morrison's widow. And I have it on good authority that the woman sitting at your kitchen table right now, she ain't named Marlowe." Caleb wiped his hands on a rag. He tossed the rag onto a barrel. "I know," Caleb said. Doc blinked. "You know?" "I've known since the day she stepped off the stagecoach." Doc took the pipe out of his mouth. "Are you out of your mind, son? If she's who I think she is, she's here to hang you. She's building a noose right inside your own house. Let her build it." Caleb picked up his hammer. He turned his back on Doc. The conversation was over. Doc stood there for a long moment. He shook his head, a mix of pity and frustration. Then he turned and walked out to the corral where Jessie was brushing down a mare. Caleb stayed in the barn, but he could hear them. Doc leaned against the fence rail. He looked at the 19-year-old kid. "Jessie," Doc said softly, "you ever wonder why Mr. Dunn never goes into town? Why he never drinks? Why he lives like a monk?" Jessie shrugged. "Reckon it ain't my business." "Maybe it should be," Doc said. He looked back toward the house. "Because hell is coming to this ranch. And you ought to know what kind of man you're working for before it gets here." Doc took a pull from his pipe. And then he told the boy the story. 4 years ago, back in Oregon, Caleb was a deputy. Good one, straight as a plumb line. There was a land broker in town, name of Robert Morrison. Charming fella, wore nice suits, smiled a lot. Morrison was selling land to new pioneer families, taking their life savings. Only problem was the land didn't belong to him. It was treaty land. The army came through and kicked 20 families off into the snow. Left them with nothing. Jessie stopped brushing the mare. He was listening now. "Caleb did his job," Doc continued. "He investigated, found the fake deeds, went to arrest Morrison. Now, Morrison wasn't a fighter, but he was arrogant. He resisted right there in the jailhouse, called Caleb every name in the book, spit on him. Caleb shoved him into the cell. Didn't mean to hurt him, just a shove to get him behind the bars. But Morrison tripped, went down hard, hit his head on the iron corner of the cot." Doc paused. The wind whistled through the corral boards. He didn't pass out right away. He sat up, cursed Caleb out. So Caleb locked the door and walked away. He was angry. He didn't check on him. 3 days later, Morrison died of a slow bleed in the brain. If Caleb had called a doctor that first night, Morrison would have lived. Jesse stared at Doc, wide-eyed. So Mr. Dunn, he killed him? The law didn't think so, Doc said, but the town split in half. And then Morrison's widow took the stand. She swore up and down her husband was a gentle, peaceful man who never raised his voice. That lie made Caleb look like a brute who beat a helpless man to death. Doc pointed the stem of his pipe toward the far edge of the property, toward the smokehouse. You see that patch of dirt out back? The one Mr. Dunn puts a flower on every Monday? Jesse nodded slowly. That ain't a dead dog, son. That's Robert Morrison. Jesse paled. He buried him here? Morrison's family wouldn't claim the body. They were too ashamed of the swindle. The county was going to throw him in a pauper's ditch. Caleb couldn't stomach it. He bought a wagon, packed Morrison in ice, and drove him 300 miles to this piece of land, just so the man he accidentally killed would have a proper resting place. Doc knocked the ashes out of his pipe against the heel of his boot. That's the man you work for, Jesse. A man carrying a cross that doesn't even belong to him. Night came to Cedar Flat. The wind died down. The cabin was quiet, save for the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Caleb sat in his rocking chair. The ledger book was open on his lap, but he wasn't looking at the numbers. Eliza sat across from him on the sofa. She was mending a shirt. The silence between them was different tonight. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of Sunday. It was a heavy electric tension. The air before a lightning strike. Caleb looked at her. He watched the needle dip in and out of the fabric. He watched the firelight catch the loose strands of her dark hair. He felt it rising in his chest, the desperate, clawing need to tell the truth, to strip it all away, to say, I know you're Clara's sister. I know you're Morrison's widow. I am so damn sorry. He opened his mouth. Miss Marlowe. Eliza stopped sewing. She didn't look up immediately. When she finally raised her head, her slate-gray eyes met his. Caleb stared into them, and the words died in his throat. Because he didn't see curiosity in her eyes. He didn't see the guarded politeness of a hired bookkeeper. He saw recognition. He saw a woman who was looking at a ghost, a woman who carried the same crushing, suffocating weight of a past they both shared. She knows, Caleb realized. A cold chill ran down his spine. She knows I'm on to her. She knows everything. He closed his mouth. The silence stretched tight, humming like a piano wire. Did you need something, Mr. Dunn? She asked softly. Her voice wasn't a challenge, it was an invitation. She was leaving the door cracked open, waiting to see if he would walk through it. Caleb looked down at his ledger. He gripped the edges of the book until his knuckles turned white. No, he whispered into the firelight. I forgot what I was going to say. Eliza looked at him for a long, profound moment. Whenever it comes back to you, Mr. Dunn, she said gently, I will be right here. She went back to her sewing, and Caleb sat in the dark, knowing that the storm hadn't passed. It had just finally arrived at his front door. Trouble doesn't usually knock on the frontier, it just rides up your driveway and waits for you to step outside. It was mid-May. The prairie grass was turning a hard, vibrant green. A lone rider came up the road. He was on a big dapple-gray gelding. He wore a canvas duster covered in trail dust and a flat-brimmed hat. Pinned to his vest was a silver star, United States Marshal. Caleb was on the porch. He was splicing a lasso. He didn't stand up. He just stopped working and watched the law ride in. Eliza was inside, standing by the kitchen window. She felt the blood drain from her face. She knew what that star meant. Greer, her lawyer in Denver. He had finally pushed the paperwork through. The trap she had set months ago was snapping shut. And she was standing inside it. The marshal pulled his horse up to the porch. Caleb Dunn? Depends on who's asking. Elias Garrett, U.S. Marshal out of Denver. Garrett swung down from the saddle. He didn't hover his hand over his iron. He was a professional. He reached into his duster and pulled out a folded piece of heavy parchment. He walked up the steps, held it out. "You ain't under arrest, Mr. Dunn. But Judge Parsons is riding circuit. He'll be holding court in Cedar Flat on the 14th of June. You are ordered to appear and give testimony regarding the death of one Robert Morrison, year 1879. Caleb looked at the paper. He didn't flinch. He didn't ask questions. He just reached out, took the summons, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "I'll be there. See that you are, because if you ain't, I come back with irons." Garrett tipped his hat. "Good day to you." He got back on the gray and rode out. Caleb picked up his rope, went back to splicing, like it was just another Tuesday. Inside the cabin, Eliza gripped the edge of the sink until her fingers ached. Something was wrong. Greer was a Denver lawyer. To get a territorial judge to hear a case in a local jurisdiction, you needed a local plaintiff, someone in the county to sponsor the petition. Eliza hadn't authorized a local sponsor. She hadn't even given Greer the green light to file. Someone else was pushing the wheel. The next morning, Eliza took the buckboard into town. She went straight to the county clerk's office. It was a dusty room above the mercantile, smelling of old paper and stale tobacco. She asked to see the docket for Judge Parsons' upcoming circuit. The clerk, a sleepy man with ink-stained fingers, slid the heavy book across the counter. Eliza dragged her finger down the page. Docket 42, Civil Inquiry, the estate of Robert Morrison versus Caleb Dunn. She looked at the column on the far right, the name of the local sponsor, the person who had paid the filing fee and sworn the affidavit to bring the law to Cedar Flat. It wasn't her lawyer. The name written in black ink was Hattie Dunlop. Eliza stopped breathing. Hattie, the widow next door, the woman who brought warm sourdough bread. Eliza's mind raced, slamming the pieces together. Hattie's maiden name didn't matter. Her married name was Dunlop, but her late husband was Thomas Morrison, Robert's older brother. Hattie was Robert's sister-in-law. She had been living half a mile from the man who killed him for 4 years. And she had been watching, waiting. Eliza closed the ledger. She walked out of the office. The Montana sun was blinding, but she felt entirely cold. An hour later, Eliza pulled the wagon up to Hattie's neat, whitewashed house. Hattie was on the porch, shelling peas into a tin bowl. She looked up, smiled that same polite neighbor's smile. "Miss Marlowe, what a pleasant surprise. Will you have some tea?" "No," Eliza said. She climbed down, walked up the steps. She didn't sit. "Mrs. Dunlop, I saw the docket in town." Hattie's hands stopped moving. The peas hit the bottom of the bowl with a sharp ping. The polite smile vanished. It was replaced by something old, something tired. "Ah," Hattie said softly. "I see. You filed the petition. You brought the judge here." "I did." Hattie looked out over the prairie, toward Caleb's land. "I've known about the grave behind the smokehouse for 3 years. I crept over there one night, measured it. It's a man's grave. I wrote to the county. I found out what happened in Oregon." Hattie looked back at Eliza. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "My husband Thomas died of a weak heart in 81. Robert died in 79. I am the last of the family in this territory. The town told me to move on. Let sleeping dogs lie." Hattie's voice grew hard. "But then I started hearing laughter coming from that house. I saw Caleb Dunn looking peaceful. He gets to have a life, while Robert rots under an unmarked pile of dirt. No, not without an answer. Not." Eliza looked at the older woman. She saw the grief, the desperate need for the world to make sense. "Hattie," Eliza whispered. "It's Mrs. Dunlop, Miss Marlowe." "My name isn't Marlowe." Hattie froze. Eliza stood tall. She let the mask shatter. "My name is Eliza Morrison. Robert was my husband." The tin bowl slipped from Hattie's lap. The peas scattered across the porch boards. Hattie stared at her. The color drained from her face. "Eliza! Good Lord above, I haven't seen you since the funeral." "It's been 4 years. What are you doing in that man's house?" "The same thing you are doing," Eliza said, her voice cracking. Looking for the truth. But I've been living with him for 6 weeks, Hattie. And I am telling you, I am no longer sure the truth is what we want. They sat on the porch for 3 hours, two widows bonded by a ghost. Eliza told Hattie things she had never told a living soul. She told her about the drinking, about the temper, about the night Robert hit her so hard she tasted copper for a week. Hattie listened. She cried. And then she admitted that Thomas had always warned her that his little brother had a darkness in him, a darkness the world didn't see. I thought Caleb Dunn was the devil, Hattie whispered, wiping her eyes with an apron. But maybe Robert helped make him that way. Maybe they are both just men, carrying crosses we can't see. Night fell on the Dunn ranch. Caleb was sitting on the front porch. The ledger book was on his lap, but it was closed. He was just looking at the stars. The screen door creaked. Eliza stepped out. She didn't have a shawl. She stood in the chill night air. She looked at the broad slope of Caleb's shoulders. It was time. Mr. Dunn. Caleb didn't turn around. Miss Marlowe, I have to tell you something, and I have to say it right now because if I wait until tomorrow, the coward in me will bury it again. Caleb stayed perfectly still. Go ahead. Eliza took a breath. It felt like inhaling glass. My name is not Eliza Marlowe. My name is Eliza Morrison. Clara was my older sister, and Robert Morrison, the man buried behind your smokehouse, was my husband. She let the words hang in the air. I bought your bank debt. I came here to find out if you murdered him. Everything I have told you is a lie. Almost everything. She waited for the explosion, for the anger, for him to stand up and order her off his land. Silence. Heavy. Eternal. Caleb slowly placed the ledger on the floorboards. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked over his shoulder, up at her, and then he said the 3 words that broke her completely. I know, Eliza. Her knees went weak. She grabbed the porch railing to stay standing. What? I've known since your 3rd week here. His voice was low, gentle. You looked at that grave the same way I look at it, like you owe it a debt. And the dress, I bought that fabric for Clara in '77. You wore it the day you arrived. You wanted me to know. You just didn't know how to say it. Eliza sank down onto the wooden boards. She couldn't hold herself up anymore. She didn't weep, but she couldn't breathe. You knew, she gasped. And you let me stay? Caleb turned around in his chair. He faced her fully in the moonlight. I wanted to know who you were, but more than that, I wanted the chance to tell the truth, not to a judge, not to a marshal, to you, because you're the only person left alive who is owed an answer. The wind swept across the porch. And, Caleb added, his voice finally breaking, I wanted you to stay long enough so I could apologize to your sister, through you, because I never went to Clara's grave. I couldn't. He looked at his calloused hands. I let the badge take over after she died, and that badge led me straight into the jail cell with your husband. If Clara had lived, none of this would have happened. I am so sorry, Eliza, for all of it. I just don't know how to carry it anymore. Eliza sat on the floorboards, looking at the broken, beautiful man in front of her. The secrets were out. The war was over. And all that was left was the ruins. Fire is a funny thing. It burns the rot away, but it leaves the ground scorched black. You have to wait a long time to see if anything green ever pushes back through the ash. Eliza didn't pack her bags. She didn't run. She stayed on the porch. Caleb went inside, poured 2 cups of black coffee, and brought them out. He handed her a tin cup. Their fingers brushed. Neither pulled away. They sat there in the dark, and they finally burned the rot away. I arrested him at 7 in the evening, Caleb said softly, staring out into the pitch-black prairie. He fought me out in the street. I shoved him into the cell. He wouldn't stay down. I locked the door. I turned my back. Caleb took a sip of the bitter coffee. He called me a stray dog. called me uneducated filth, said terrible things about Clara. And Caleb closed his eyes. I did the one thing a man wearing a star is never supposed to do. I lost my temper. I unlocked the door. I walked in, and I shoved him, hard. The confession hung in the air, stark and ugly. He stumbled backward, tripped over his own boots, and his head hit the iron frame of the cot. The sound, it sounded like a melon dropping on a hardwood floor. Eliza closed her eyes. She gripped the warm tin cup. He didn't pass out, Caleb continued. He sat up. He cursed me. So I walked out. I locked the door, and I went to sleep. Caleb turned to look at her. His eyes were hollow. I didn't check on him. Doc Harlan told me later if I had called him that night, Robert might have lived, but I was angry. I left him in there for 3 days before I realized he was dying. I didn't mean to kill him, Eliza, but my anger did. It was just slower than a bullet. Eliza didn't offer him cheap forgiveness. She didn't pat his hand and tell him it wasn't his fault, because it was. She just asked the only question that mattered. If you could go back to that night, she said, knowing everything, would you still arrest him? Caleb didn't hesitate. Yes. He stole land from 20 families. They were starving. I had a duty to stop it. Eliza nodded, not accepting it, just acknowledging the brutal, gray reality of it. Now it's my turn, she said. She looked down at the floorboards. When the investigator came to my house in '79, he asked me if Robert had a temper, if he was violent. She swallowed hard. I told him no. I told him Robert was a gentleman who never raised his voice. Caleb frowned slightly. He fought me in the street, Eliza. I know. She looked up at him. He fought me, too, when he drank. 3 months into our marriage, he backhanded me so hard he broke my tooth. Caleb went completely still. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. I lied to the investigator, Eliza said, her voice trembling. Because if the town knew I was a battered wife, they would have looked at me with pity and disgust. The courts might have challenged his will. I would have been left with nothing. So I lied. She met Caleb's eyes. My lie is what got you fired. My lie is what made the town turn against you. I painted him as a saint, which made you a monster. I destroyed your life, Caleb, because I was scared. They sat in the quiet. 2 people who had ruined each other. We both hold a piece of the blame, Eliza whispered. None of us is clean, and neither of us is the devil. The weeks leading up to the trial were different. The silence in the house wasn't tense anymore. It was focused, like a trench before a battle. They prepared together. Eliza used her brilliant mind for ledgers to organize the timeline of events. Caleb wrote out his testimony by hand. Doc Harlan agreed to take the stand to testify about the medical reality of the injury. But the most important work wasn't on paper. A few days before the judge was due to arrive, Eliza rode back out to Hattie Dunlop's house. The 2 widows sat at the kitchen table. He isn't going to lie on the stand, Hattie, Eliza said. Caleb is going to confess to the shove. He's going to accept whatever the judge hands down. Hattie stirred her tea. And what do you want me to do, Eliza? I want you to know the truth before you hear it in a crowded room. My husband wasn't innocent. Caleb isn't a murderer. The truth is somewhere in the messy middle. And none of us can start living again until we accept that. Hattie looked at her tea. I don't want him to hang, Eliza, Hattie said quietly. I never wanted a hanging. I just want someone to say Robert's name without looking at their boots. I just want it to be over. It will be, Eliza promised. June 13th, the night before the trial. The heat of summer was starting to settle over Montana. The crickets were loud in the tall grass. A crescent moon hung low over the ridge. Caleb and Eliza sat on the porch. Tomorrow they would walk into a makeshift courtroom. Tomorrow a judge would decide if Caleb would lose his freedom and if Eliza would lose her name. But tonight, it didn't matter. Caleb leaned his head back against the timber wall. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Caleb said softly, "I need you to know something." "What's that, Caleb?" It was the first time she had used his given name. "The best thing that has come from the worst thing I ever did," he turned his head to look at her, "was you walking through my door." Eliza gave a sad, broken little smile. "I walked through your door to ruin you." "I know," he said. "And instead you became the only person in this world who took the time to figure out who I actually am." They didn't reach for each other. They didn't kiss. They didn't talk about love. They didn't need to. They just sat there, shoulder to shoulder in the dark. Two people who had seen the absolute worst parts of each other and decided not to run away. The trial was tomorrow. But the fire had already burned out, and they had both survived the flames. The 14th of June, 1883. The Methodist Church in Cedar Flat didn't look much like a courtroom. They had pushed the pews back, dragged a heavy oak table to the front. Judge Parsons sat behind the pulpit. He was 58, face like a dried riverbed, fair but hard. It was hot, the kind of suffocating still heat that makes men sweat through their broadcloth suits. Caleb took the stand first. He didn't wear a tie. He just sat there, hands folded, and told the truth. He told the judge about the arrest, about the street fight, about the shove in the cell. He didn't dress it up. He didn't ask for mercy. Doc Harlan went next, confirmed the medical facts, then Hattie Dunlop. She stood up, her hands trembling, and told the room she didn't want a hanging. She just wanted the truth spoken in the light of day. And then it was Eliza's turn. She walked up to the front. She was wearing the dress, the slate blue poplin, the dress she had worn the day she arrived. She put her hand on the Bible, swore the oath. Lawyer Greer stood up. He adjusted his spectacles. He thought he had a winning hand. "Mrs. Morrison," Greer said. His voice echoed off the timber walls. "You came to this town to investigate Mr. Dunn. Tell the court. Did you find evidence that he acted with criminal malice? Did he murder your husband?" Eliza looked at Greer. Then she looked at Caleb. Then at Hattie. "No," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a blade. "No," she repeated. "I didn't find a murderer. I found a good man who made a terrible mistake. On a terrible night. I found a man who has spent 4 years punishing himself harsher than this court ever could." Greer frowned. "Mrs. Morrison, I must remind you." "And I must tell the court the rest of it," Eliza interrupted. She turned to face Judge Parsons. She stood incredibly straight. "In 1879, I gave a sworn statement to the investigator in Oregon. I said my husband was a gentleman. I said he never resorted to violence." She gripped the wooden rail of the witness stand. That was a lie. The church went dead quiet. You could hear a horse stamp its foot out in the street. "Robert Morrison hit me," Eliza said, her voice shaking now but refusing to break. "More than once. I lied to the authorities because I was ashamed and because I was terrified of losing my home. My lie is what made Mr. Dunn's actions look like unprovoked murder. I am responsible for that." She looked at Caleb, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "I came here to ruin him. But the only person who deserves to be ruined for this is me." Judge Parsons took 20 minutes to deliberate. He didn't leave the room. He just sat at the pulpit, writing in his ledger. Finally, he looked up. He set his pen down. "There is not enough evidence here to support a charge of criminal malice," Parsons announced. "The death of Robert Morrison was a tragedy, born of anger, born of carelessness. But it is not murder." He banged his gavel, a sharp, flat crack. "Case dismissed." The judge looked down at Caleb. "You're free to go, Mr. Dunn. But understand me. Freedom ain't the same thing as innocence. You carry what you carry. I can't lift that off you. Only you can." Then he looked at Eliza. "Mrs. Morrison, it takes grit to stand up and admit to perjury. Honesty is never too late. But it never wipes the slate clean either. You have to live with what your lie did to this man. The court adjourned. The crowd filed out into the blinding sun. It was over. But it wasn't. Not really. The next morning, Eliza took the buckboard into town. She walked into the post office. Mrs. Pruitt was sorting mail. Eliza handed over 2 thick envelopes. The first envelope was addressed to the First Bank of Cedar Flat. Inside was the paperwork, signed by Eliza, using the legal bookkeeping authority Caleb had granted her, canceling Caleb's $340 debt entirely. The second envelope was addressed to Willamette Trust in Portland. It contained an authorized draft, transferring every single cent of Caleb's $2,000 settlement directly to the relief fund for the families Robert had swindled. She mailed them both. She wiped his debt, and she gave away his fortune. She stripped him of the very things he was using to punish himself. She knew he was going to be furious. It took 3 days for the bank notice to reach the ranch. Caleb opened the letter on the porch. He read it again. He stood up. The chair scraped hard against the floorboards. He walked around to the side of the house, where Eliza was hanging laundry on the line. "What did you do?" His voice was a low, dangerous rumble. Eliza didn't flinch. She pinned a shirt to the line, turned around. "I did what you wouldn't." Caleb closed the distance between them. Real anger flashed in his eyes, not the quiet, brooding guilt he usually wore. Hot, living anger. "You had no right," he snarled. "That was my money, my decision." "It was Robert's debt," she fired back, matching his volume. "Paid by his blood. With money you wouldn't even touch because it felt dirty. Well, it's gone now, and those 20 families actually have something to eat. You don't get to decide my penance, Eliza. And you don't get the right to punish yourself forever," she yelled. Her chest heaved. "At some point, Caleb, at some damn point, you have to stop paying for the crime of surviving." They stood inches apart, breathing hard, furious, because they were both right. "You lied to me," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "For months." "Yes." "You came here to hang me." "Yes." "And then you gave away my money." "Yes." Caleb stared at her. "Why should I ever trust a single thing you say or do?" Eliza looked at him. The wind whipped her dark hair across her face. Her slate-gray eyes were entirely stripped of defenses. "You shouldn't," she said softly. "Trust has to be earned. I haven't earned it yet." She swallowed hard. "But I'm asking for a chance to begin." Caleb didn't have an answer. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say. He just stood there, in the uncomfortable, messy, entirely real silence. And slowly, the silence became bearable. A week later, Monday morning, the frost was heavy on the grass. Caleb walked out the back door, past the smokehouse, out to the mound of dirt. But this time, he didn't walk alone. Eliza walked beside him. Their boots crunched in rhythm on the frozen ground. They stood over the grave. Caleb held a wild bluebonnet. Eliza held one too. She knelt down, placed her flower on the dirt. Caleb knelt beside her, placed his right next to hers. "I'm going to do this with you," Eliza said quietly. "Every Monday, until we both feel like we've said enough. It might take a long time." "I know." Caleb looked at her. The early morning light caught the edges of her face. "I don't forgive you for lying to me," he said. "I know. I don't know if I ever will." "I know that too." Caleb stood up. He reached out a calloused hand. "But I want you to stay," he said, "while I figure it out." Eliza looked at his hand. She reached out, and she took it. "I'll stay." They didn't kiss. They didn't fall into each other's arms. They just turned around, hands clasped, and walked back toward the cabin. This literary work is intended purely as fiction. Any similarities to real individuals or events are coincidental and arise solely from the nature of storytelling. The author does not claim accuracy regarding real-world details and does not intend to portray real-life circumstances.
Out here on the frontier, where the wind never stops talking and the land remembers more than people do, stories don't end clean. They settle, they linger, and sometimes they leave behind something quieter than justice, something closer to truth. What we've just witnessed is not a tale of heroes and villains. It's a story about two people standing in the wreckage of their own choices, learning that guilt can shape a life just as much as love can. Caleb Dunn believed that suffering was the only honest way to live after what he had done. He carried his mistake like a sentence carved in stone, refusing comfort, refusing forgiveness, because he thought he hadn't earned the right to either. And Eliza, she came chasing justice, only to discover that the truth she needed to survive had once destroyed another man. Both of them were wrong, and both of them were right. That's the hard truth this story leaves us with. Life is rarely divided into innocence and blame. Most of us are living somewhere in between, trying to make sense of the consequences we didn't fully understand when we made our choices. The deeper lesson here isn't about the past itself, but about what we choose to do with it. Caleb shows us the danger of holding on too tightly to guilt, of believing that pain is the only form of accountability. Because punishment without purpose doesn't heal anything, it just keeps the wound open. And Eliza reminds us that fear can lead us to choices that ripple far beyond what we can see. A single lie, spoken to protect herself, reshaped the course of another man's life. And yet, she still found the courage to stand in the light and tell the truth, even when it cost her everything. That's where the meaning of this story truly lives, not in the tragedy, but in what comes after, in the quiet decision to face the truth, in the strength it takes to admit, I was wrong, in the fragile, uncertain beginning of forgiveness, not the kind that erases the past, but the kind that allows a future to exist despite it. Because in the end, redemption isn't something the world hands to you. It's something you build slowly, painfully, through honesty, responsibility, and the willingness to keep going even when you don't feel deserving of a second chance. And maybe that's the question this story leaves us with. How long should a person keep paying for their past? And who gets to decide when the debt is finally enough? Out here in the West, there's no clear answer. Just people trying their best to live with what they've done and hoping that somewhere along the way, they find a reason to keep walking forward.